So this is just some brief comments on David Bentley Hart's new book, That All Shall Be Saved, Heaven, Hell, and Universal Salvation. Now, this book, this is not supposed to be a formal review on my part. I'm thinking about doing some kind of review essay for publication somewhere on this, but I would really have to delve a lot more in depth than I'm able to do in just a short video. So this is just some of my thoughts as I've been discussing this with some people, and people have asked for my thoughts on these issues, especially since David Bentley Hart is someone who I have quoted specifically with issues related to classical theism, and then also with issues related to materialism and dualism and those kinds of questions related to the human person. So I have, for those of you who aren't familiar with David Bentley Hart, he's an Eastern Orthodox philosopher slash theologian, just all around thinker, who's published in a number of different areas. He's, I think, best when he's dealing with philosophy and not so much when he's dealing with theology, which he has dealt more into recently. He has a translation of the New Testament, which was a very talked about project. He had kind of a back and forth with N.T. Wright over a number of things. And I think when it comes to scholarship in the New Testament, there really is no question that N.T. Wright is the better thinker. And I think when it comes to issues of philosophy, David Bentley Hart himself is clearly the better thinker than Wright. So, everybody has their own areas of expertise. And I think when they step outside of the lines of what that expertise is, you often can fall into some serious issues. So David Bentley Hart has been known for promoting an idea of a kind of universalism for a little while. He's mentioned it in other work, but this is the first time he's attempted to write a full-length treatment and defense of that particular perspective. And so he frames this not in the sense of just a regular kind of universalism where you die, you all go to heaven. He does take the idea of hell seriously to an extent. And what he does is tries to promote the view that you find in some early church fathers, most notably Origen. And Origen is very well known for his view that there is this kind of universal restoration or reuniting of all things with God. And so for Origen, this includes those who are in hell as well as even the demons and Satan himself, so that all things eventually are going to be reconciled unto God. And so you have this kind of three-step eschatology. You have people dying now, and they end up in a state awaiting the resurrection of the body, and then you have the resurrection of the body, you have final judgment, and then after that, at some point, there is this universal reconciliation, this kind of third phase that occurs where all things are then reunited to God, and that means that there will be no hell, at least eternally. It's a temporal thing. Now, I do believe that David Bentley Hart really doesn't give enough detail even about exactly what that means, what hell is in his perspective. He spends really the majority of his time talking about this universal restoration. And when you get into his arguments, the arguments are set in a series of basically four meditations on various aspects of this. And you find that there are various aspects of this. So one is the philosophical argument. And then there is the really emotional argument, an experiential argument of wrestling with this notion of an eternal hell. Then you have the exegetical argument, and you have the historical argument. So Hart really gets into all of these at different points in this book, but it's pretty clear from the outset that the driving force is this emotional argument. It's, he even gives some kind of personal reflection, which was a bit surprising to me. I think Hart is very convincing and logical when he's dealing with philosophy in a lot of ways. But here I've kind of found him to be anything but that, because it's very clear that his own experience is really the driving force, and his emotional kind of visceral response or visceral reaction to the notion of an eternal hell. And for him, this just doesn't make sense with the goodness of God. He does come up to a point, even at the end of the book, saying that, okay, if you were to prove that an eternal hell is necessitated in Christian belief, he would give up his Christian faith because it doesn't make moral sense to him. So I think we have really the root of what is the major problem of the book, is that it is really an emotional argument, I think, as the driving force, which is surprising coming from Hart. But you do sense this, I think, in some of the comments about morality that I've heard from Hart before, especially relating to some of the moral problems of the Old Testament, such as the Canaanite conquest, that he really struggles profoundly morally with how these things could be just. And I think in those areas he tends to jump really to a "this doesn't sit right with me" kind of argument, and he certainly phrases it in a much better and more sophisticated way than that, with a lot bigger words, which is Hart's tendency to do a lot of the time. But I think in some ways that gives an intellectual air to what is really an emotional argument, and pretty clearly, he speaks about a moral imbecility throughout, and Hart has these little phrases, and if you read Hart, you know that he does this throughout his books. Like the utter fortuity of existence. You've got these little phrases that he uses over and over again in a lot of his work. And you find that in various books. And in this book, it's that phrase moral imbecility that seems to be this oft repeated phrase. And so it's very clear that he has really a moral issue. And I think the moral issue comes down to moral intuition, which is why I say it is an emotional issue. And I think he basically admits as much in the beginning of the book. And so it's very clear from the outset that he rejects the notion of an eternal hell based on his own moral intuition. And it doesn't make sense to him, his concept of love, his concept of goodness. Yes, these are the same arguments that we're constantly hearing and wrestling with in the church. Is this doesn't make sense to me with God's love. This doesn't make sense to me with God's goodness. Hart does it in a more sophisticated way than you'll find, on a popular level, certainly. But the essence of the argument is basically the same. It comes down to an emotional reaction to certain notions and how it makes sense with one's idea of goodness and of love. And Hart does speak about, speaking of God in terms of analogy. And he basically says that analogy necessitates, so he's not arguing for a kind of univocity. In other words, he's not saying that, yes, God's love is the same as my love, but my love is analogous, right, to God's love. My love reflects God's love. And he basically says, well, if that is the case, then God's love has to include this universal reconciliation. And if not, then there is not even any analogy. There's nothing analogous even between my love and God's love, or my goodness and God's goodness. It has to be totally equivocal. So he rejects that notion. And so it's largely based on his own understanding of what love and goodness are. He says that has to be reflected in a way that makes sense to creatures, in that there really is this mirroring of God's goodness and love in us. And so therefore we have to, we can, he's just trying to justify, we can morally, in a sense, reason from what we believe is love and good to what is true of God, because those things are mirrored in us. So I think really, though, what the argument, and he gets into a moral argument, and he discusses issues of liberty and free will. He gets into his own particularly philosophical perspective on freedom and its relation to the intellect and its relation to ignorance. And he believes basically that moral defect is in some sense a result of ignorance, or in some sense a result of not being educated. So that, that argument goes where it goes. And I think it really merits a lot further exploration than he gives here. And that is, he often does this throughout this book. He says, someone I was talking to said this. And then kind of gives these disparaging remarks and this little summary, which is very clearly probably not a very thorough or accurate summary of what the other person's argument is, without really citing specifically what that person is arguing for. And I think in doing that, he makes the arguments sound much worse, I think, than they really are. He's pretty harsh about Thomists in here, which is, I think, in a way kind of unfortunate, because Hart, especially in his work on materialism and naturalism, has so much in common with Thomists. Throughout this book, he's basically placing everyone else in the position of an enemy. And the tone throughout the book is very ungracious, and Hart's always ungracious, but this is particularly so. And even when he gets to the last chapter, his conclusion, he says, he gets to the point of saying, well, normally you'd want to say, okay, I understand the arguments that some people have had, and respectable people have disagreed and had these opinions. But he says, but I'm not going to do that because I'm right. And Hart's intellectual arrogance is clear in anything he says. I mean, you know that from just watching a lecture or read his back and forth with NT Wright. It was a bit interesting personality quirks come out there, and you've always known that in Hart, and that doesn't mean his work is not worthwhile, but you kind of have to expect that writer. But it was really hyped up in this book, even more so I think than many of the others, in a way that I think was just completely unhelpful, and really is just going to cause those who have a differing position to kind of dismiss his argument. Because he's not really doing it in a careful scholarly way like he usually does. It really comes across as just attack, as I'm right and no one else is, and as very kind of emotional. So all of that being said, what really I think this all comes down to is the scriptural evidence, and that's really where the bulk of the book should be. But when he's come to the scriptural evidence, he's already covered his emotional objections. He's already covered what he sees as his philosophical objections to the eternity of hell at that point, and he's already discussed even church history. And his discussion of church history was extremely lacking. He doesn't deal with the ecumenical rejections of Origenism and exactly what that implies and means, which oftentimes in history is a rejection of his notion of final universal salvation. That's how it's been viewed. Now he says that's not what is actually rejected by the councils of the church, but there's no real in-depth argument, so he doesn't really make the point. You'd have to defend that, and you'd have to do so pretty in depth to make a good argument that that's the case. So he basically uses Gregory of Nyssa and Origen almost exclusively, and if you're going to make a historical argument, you've really got to do more than that. And he pulls out some other quotes, but it really is not a strong argument. You have to use other scholars. You have to do some more in-depth study, especially in terms of the decisions of the ecumenical councils. And what is the rejection of Origenism mean? What aspects of Origen's thought have been rejected historically by the church? And what does that mean? Those questions are really not delved into. I mean, there are a couple kind of comments here and there, but not nearly what is merited by the subject. So by the time he gets to the scriptural point, he's already shown his conclusion. And I think it's very clear that scripture for Hart is going to be read necessarily in light of the conclusion he's already come to. And so I don't see much of an honest reading of the text, and I don't see an in-depth engagement. And this is really what you need to do, is if you're going to make this argument for universal salvation, and recognizing that the majority of interpreters of the New Testament have not seen it that way, you need to demonstrate that very clearly. And you need to go passage by passage and demonstrate what is wrong with these interpretations. So he spends most of his time dealing with two things. One is the interpretation of the term aion or aionios, this word that's translated as another age or eternal. Does it always mean eternal? And I think, you can look at a lot of New Testament scholarship on this issue, and it's clear that no, the passage that particular phrase, an aeon, is not necessarily an eternal age, but how is it used in context, especially in terms of the parallel that's used between the time of being in heaven and in hell. There's this parallelism, which, he talks about parallelisms in other senses, but not there. So there are very particular reasons why scholars have interpreted the term that particular way in the New Testament passages, but Hart doesn't really engage that. And the other thing he does is, yes, he points to all of these very universal passages that show up in Paul's thought, so that this notion that, yes, redemption is ultimately a cosmic reality. It is a universal reality. He points to the places where you find, a universal atonement or a universal reconciliation that occurs. But many Christians have recognized the use of these passages and have not come to the conclusion that he's come to. And he doesn't deal with any of them in any particular depth. It's just this very broad overview, which, is fine for a popular level book. That's what you're going to do. But for Hart to be so dismissive of all of the other positions and how ridiculous he finds them, if you're going to make that kind of those kinds of bold statements, you've got to have a really solid argument. Okay, you've got to have a really good argument to say, here's why the majority of Christians in history have all interpreted all of these passages wrong. And he doesn't do that. So he does not have the right to speak the way he does about other positions unless he has made an extremely convincing, very clear argument, verse by verse, text by text, argument for those passages. And he does, give away his own view of Scripture, that he doesn't necessarily see internal consistency in the New Testament, nor does he have to. And from his perspective, then he doesn't really have to defend himself from each passage in terms of how they're understood. And I really found, as one who's more a systematician, I found a lot of his arguments very amateur, especially his dismissive arguments about Calvinism that he makes. He clearly does not understand Calvinism at all. And it's pretty shocking, kind of from a scholar of his, of his caliber, to really make the kinds of dismissive statements that he does, and to just say things that, his arguments against, propitiation and his caricature of a Protestant approach to the atonement was just really bad. And the kind of things that you find in really bad kind of Arminian polemics or liberal polemics against conservative evangelicalism. And I'm not saying this not even as a Calvinist, but as a Lutheran, but just his portrayal of Calvinism was really bad. It was bad. And just his portrayal of Protestantism in general was very weak and very dismissive, and really not representative at all of what the Protestant traditions teach on various topics, which I think was very, very unfortunate. And I think he probably does the same thing with certain Thomistic arguments. I'm not positive about that because I haven't read extensively in terms of Thomistic thoughts on hell, but I get that impression from what he said, because the way he presents the arguments are so bad that I'm assuming that the sources, the primary sources, are a lot more nuanced than he's saying there. Another thing he does is he delves into Romans 9, and he has this interpretation where, because Paul, he argues that because Paul uses the phrase, "What if God?" and then he goes into his dialogue about the hardening of Pharaoh and all of those things that show up in Romans 9, which has been a common proof text for Calvinism. And he interprets that whole passage as basically just that, a hypothetical that Paul then rejects, which is not a common passage interpretation in history. So I would have liked to see that fleshed out a lot more. It's a very odd interpretation. And this is what happens throughout the book, where he does give New Testament interpretation, is they're very unique interpretations of certain passages, which, okay, is fine if you want to give a very good argument for why that's the case and why everyone else is wrong in their understanding. But he doesn't do that. He doesn't do that at all. It's just this kind of dismissive argument. So, yeah, my thoughts on Hart, this book, I was pretty disappointed overall. I've expected Hart to be very careful in the way that he says things, and very well reasoned and very logical in the way that he argues. And I simply did not find it in this book. This book is very clearly Hart's own experience, his own moral and existential struggles with the notion of hell that have caused him to reject it. And this book is, if you've already made up your mind on this issue, you might like the book. If you've already made up your mind that Hart is right before reading the book. But I don't think that anyone who is reading this book, really, who is concerned primarily with what Scripture argues about this topic, what Scripture states on this topic, you're not going to be convinced by the book. You're not. And Hart admits that too. He's like, nobody's going to be convinced by this book. And okay, that's fine, but why don't you try to make a book that's convincing? Why don't you actually try to delve into the arguments of the other side and delve text by text? And he says this is the last he's writing on the topic. As this has been hailed as kind of the theological book of the year, I say that is not at all the case. It may be one that is talked about. It may be the most talked about theology book of the year, but it really, in terms of the history of theology, this isn't going to have staying power. This isn't something that people are going to find very convincing and build off of at all. What you really need to have is a convincing exegetical argument, passage by passage, if you want to make this argument. And I don't think he does it well. And to be honest, I just think the New Testament doesn't teach it, so I don't think you can do it well. But if you want to make a good case, you've got to do a little better than this. So anyway, I know that the Hart fans may not be too happy with this video, but those are my thoughts on this book for what it's worth. So if you have any thoughts or disagreements with, maybe how I've characterized things, or you want to kind of respond to it, please do leave your comments below. I'll be interested to hear what you all thought of the book who had a chance to read it as well. So thanks so much. We'll see you next time. God bless.